Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for a conversation about designing for extremes. My name is Kara Rees and I'm the engagement coordinator across RMIT's 3 gallery spaces, the Design Hub Gallery downstairs, RMIT Gallery down the street, and our student exhibition space First Sight Gallery. As we come together, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we're gathered here tonight. The Wiradjuri people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their ancestors and to their elders past and present, who've cared for this country and its skyways for millennia. I extend my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us this evening, and I recognise the many mobs who come from nations all around the country who contribute to making Naarm a thriving, creative, cultural hub that we're all very lucky to spend time in. Our public programs take exhibitions beyond the gallery walls, inviting the broader public into conversations. Designing for Extremes stems from Creative Antarctica, Australian artists and writers in the far south. The exhibition and its associated public programs have been made possible through a partnership between RMIT University, the University of Tasmania, Flinders University, the Australian Antarctic Division, Nevada Museum of Art, and the Australian Research Council, as well as the dedication of the lead curator, Professor Philip Samatsis. The exhibition draws together a suite of works that span more than a century and include mediums as diverse as the written word, painting and photography, through to 3D film, Antarctic sound recordings, and complex multimedia installations, all of which invite viewers to imagine and reflect on a place that most of us will never visit. Although Antarctica instinctively feels remote and distant, it's only just over 4 hours away from Tasmania by plane. It's the engine room of the global climate driving Australia's changing weather, determining rainfall, temperatures and sea levels. It's the critical frontline location for witnessing the impacts of the climate emergency. Artists and writers who've made the journey to the far south are compelled to share their stories and to advocate for this fragile environment. I encourage you all to view the exhibition at both RMIT Gallery and Design Hub Gallery before it finishes this Saturday afternoon. So you have a very short window, but I really encourage you to get over here. This evening we're here to talk about resilient, sustainable, climate-responsive design. We invited BKK architects to partner with us for this conversation. Established in 2000 by 3 RMIT graduates, BKK promotes sustainable practice, integrate passive design, and bring First Nations voices and knowledge to projects. I'll hand over to Missy Saliba, the BKK Architects Practice Manager, to tell you more. Thanks, Missy.
Thanks, Kara. So I don't need to introduce myself because Kara's done that. We're very excited to be partnering with you and your team tonight. Thank you so much. You've done an amazing job. And thanks to the BKK team as well. Special call out to Mabel, who has been amazing getting your popcorn ready. She didn't make it, but yeah, she did brand it. But tonight we're also proud to be launching a sub-brand, I guess, to BKK Architects, which is BKK Architects Expanded, which is our 2026 talk series, a brand designed by Sean Hogan, who's in the audience tonight, one of Australia's great brand designers. But for 25 years, BKK has been a practice built on curiosity, a home to creative, collaborative people who love to solve complex challenges through rigorous inquiry, innovation, and a little fun along the way. And much of that time we've been hosting conversations that bridge our world of architecture and the world beyond it. So this is formalising really that long history of conversations. BKK Expanded is what happens when we open up the conversation, discover new perspectives, reveal hidden connections, and reimagine what's possible. And tonight we're doing exactly that. So I'm delighted to announce our panel for the evening. Miranda Nieboer, Jirra Lulla, Deb Adams, and Bradley Kerr. Yay. You can clap them, they're amazing. And before I introduce our amazing chair, Naomi Stead, I'd also like to invite you all to join us after this talk to continue the talking, which I'm stealing from you, Brad, on Sunday, because I agree with that. The talk starts after the talk at the pub. Yeah, it's where the gritty stuff happens. So we're going to go to the Oxford Scholar on Swanston Street, just down the road. I think some of you may have already been there this evening, so... So chairing tonight's conversation is Professor Naomi Stead. What an amazing woman, wow. Naomi is an architectural critic, researcher and academic leader, currently serving as Associate Deputy Vice-Chancellor Engagement in the College of Design and Social Context at RMIT. Previously head of architecture at Monash University, throughout her career she's been committed to research-based advocacy, particularly in gender equality and well-being in creative workplaces. She's edited or co-edited 6 books, including the award-winning After the Australian Ugliness, and has been the recipient of 3 Australian Research Council grants. She is widely published as a critic and commentator across architecture and related fields, most recently as architecture critic for the Saturday paper. In 2023, yes, there's more. In 2023, she was the Victorian State winner of the Bates Smart Award for Architecture and Media, and in 2024 was made an honorary fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects. Please welcome Naomi Stead.
Thanks, Missy, and thanks very much, Cara. And what a stellar panel and what a beautifully designed event. So welcome all, and I think it's going to be a good one. I am going to introduce each of our speakers one by one as they come up and give a presentation. Then we'll have a panel discussion, open to questions from the floor, and then go to the pub. To begin, Bradley Kerr is director of Winsor Kerr and a Quandamooka man working on Wiradjuri country, an architect, associate lecturer at the University of Sydney and Monash University, and co-chair of the Australian Institute of Architects First Nations Advisory Committee. Bradley champions country-centred design that prioritises community, cultural responsibility and reciprocal relationships with traditional custodians. His practice demonstrates how Indigenous knowledge systems and contemporary design can respond to complex environmental and social challenges. Recently recognised as the 2024 Victorian Emerging Architect Prize recipient, Bradley was on the curatorial team for the 2025 Architecture Venice Biennale titled Home. His work advocates for systemic change in how the built environment serves country and First Nations people, and he's going to tell us a bit more about that right now.
Thank you. Oh, God. Hi, everyone. Yara, how you going? Sweet. Good response. Love it. Unfortunately, I'm going to be reading from the screen today. Not as prepared as I would have liked to be. I'm Brad. I'm a Quandamooka man. I was born off country. I was born and raised on Ngunnawal country. And for anyone who's had like the gross misfortune of hearing me speak in the past, you know that I don't really know what I'm doing. I think that what I'm about to talk about like tangentially relates to the topic of Antarctica, but I'll let Naomi and all of you decide if that's true. So, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect and develop their cultural, heritage, traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of properties of fauna and flora, oral traditions, literatures, design, sports. They also have the right to maintain, control, protect and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. Hopefully I haven't read that out for no reason. Might it come up again. Shout out to my boy, Tenzing Norgay. Woo! We all know him, right? Can everyone put their hand up if they know who he is? Oh, that's actually so much more than I was expecting. And of course, there's Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to climb Mount Everest. In our ever-conquering search for discovery and human achievement, he did something nobody ever did. And he was pretty happy about it too. Oops, wrong button. No one remembers who climbed Mount Everest the second time. Whereas Tenzing, his partner and guide, was a little more humble about the ascent. I think he was a little bit chiller about his accomplishment. And it may have also been done in the past. So Sir Edmund Hillary described Tenzing as an incredibly strong, patient and skilled climber. He was a partner who saved his life during their 1953 expedition. And he viewed him as a loyal friend. He so kindly spoke of Tenzing as more than a guide, emphasising that they had a mutual trust and partnership. And it wasn't until later in life that Sir referred to the big dog Tenzing as a great partner, a dear friend. And he wrote in his journal of some incidents of Tenzing saving his life. And I wanted to bring this up because I think that what we learn and the way that we learn things is kind of critical, particularly in an Australian context. And the first question that I asked Missy when she invited me was, yep, sounds interesting, I'll figure it out. I'll say yes now and figure the rest out later. And I quickly came to regret that decision because it led me down a seemingly familiar line of questions, which was essentially, how was Antarctica colonised? When I started looking into the history of Antarctica, the first thing that stuck out to me were these advertisements selling the Antarctic as a bastion of knowledge, as a landscape of untamable, unimaginable scientific discovery. What great explorer wouldn't want their legacy marked by planting a flag? And who could possibly say no to funding it? I think it's kind of funny the way that Antarctica is described as like this last great wilderness, and now it's a continent of science and perceived neutrality. I also found it interesting that between 1908 and 1943, and I'm showing this because I found it interesting, so I assume all of you find it interesting, that 7 nations claimed most of the continent: the UK, France, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Argentina. And I can't help but think of a positionality exercise, which is a tool for seeing things from another perspective. And because we're here talking about exploration and expedition, I always like to ask people, if Indiana Jones is portrayed as the hero, then who's portrayed as the villains? The objects stolen only have value in a museological sense, you know, like a fixed thing with a story about its saviour from the savages, rather than a cultural or epistemological sense in which it belongs and no doubt longs for. Anyway, this led me to ask somebody really smart, someone I work with, Charity Edwards, if she had any references that depicted this kind of intangible parallel for Antarctica, and if there had been much research into its exploration pre-European settlement. After all, Australia was once classified as terra nullius, the Latin term meaning nobody's land, that pesky legal doctrine that was used in international law that means something like, this land has never been subject to sovereignty of any state or territory. And it led me to 2 journal articles. One was a short scan of Maori journeys to Antarctica, which put Polynesian, Maori and First Nations knowledges at the fore, oral traditions, and it put forward the idea of narratives of underrepresented groups and their methods of sharing stories at the forefront. And it was very quickly debated and rejected against by an article called The Improbability of Pre-European Polynesian Voyages to Antarctica, because there's no empirical data to support the assertion that blah, 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 blah. But oral stories and oral traditions, traditional carvings and practices that have historically been rejected or ignored suggest otherwise. And I think of particular interest from this article, sorry, this is so boring, the rocks that grow out of the sea in the space beyond Rapa, the monstrous seas, the female that dwells in those mountainous waves, those tresses wave about in the water and on the surface of the sea, and the frozen sea of Pia, the deceitful animal of the sea who dives to great depths, a foggy, misty and dark place not seen by the sun. Other things are like rocks whose summits pierce the skies. They are completely bare and without vegetation on them. This knowledge and this way of sharing a story speaks to different ways of sharing histories through carvings, carvings that have depicted voyages and navigation, and I guess the idea of astronomical knowledge. And I don't think it's something that people value or appreciate quite enough, like carvings act as repositories of knowledge in an oral culture. The ocean isn't just a barrier, it's an extension of country. And I'd highly recommend further readings into Polynesian understandings of water and relationships between the ocean and the stars, because I think it's beautiful. I think we've all heard the stories as well of Burke and Wills. What was the determining factor of their death? How did they die? The official recorded version is that they died of starvation and malnutrition. And on this expedition that was officially led by European officers, relied heavily on Indigenous knowledge for water sources, pathways, songlines, methods of travel. Something that's less touched on is this unwillingness to ask female Indigenous guides where they found their sustenance. In a country so vast and with trade routes dating back 65,000 years, I'd probably conjecture that Burke and Wills did not die from starvation or malnutrition, but rather ego and a lack of humility led to their categorical failure in achieving their 3 goals, 2 of which I think are kind of ironic, not in the Alanis Morissette version. But one was of scientific discovery and the other of seeking new grazing land. And I reckon a pretty humble call for help from the mob that let the Europeans lead the voyage while being just so slightly in front of them and calmly calling out for the proper direction, for some info on Indigenous plants, foods, fibres and sources that had sustained that mob since time immemorial may have seemed to be the smart thing to do. Uncle Dave Wandon, Wurundjeri elder, shares and encourages the sharing of a way of thinking about our landscapes. Indigenous peoples didn't sustain their diets on pig and cattle or utilise materials in a colonial architectural sense. Uncle Dave teaches a lot if you're willing to listen, and he will keep going and going and going. He's a very generous man. But one of the things that he teaches and wants people to learn is that Indigenous flora is used for a few things: food, tools, medicine, shelter, fibre. And I say this because the Victorian volcanic plains have seen 99% destruction. So there's less than 1% left. I think that almost categorises it as extinct. And Boonwurrung elder Uncle Shane Clark shares that once our old people are gone, nobody is going to know where anything is. And that a time in the future will come where all the smart people will lament at the passing of Indigenous knowledge holders. I mean, it wasn't really that long ago that Boonwurrung mob would visit their neighbours. They just stopped going when the bridge went underwater. And I think in an era of ecological decline, something that Uncle Dave prompted us to think about, which made me rethink this whole slide deck and send it through super late, apologies, was that our ecologies, Indigenous ecologies, haven't been monopolised. They haven't gone through the trauma of extreme monoculture, of monsters like the appropriately named Monsanto, who have changed our foods and resources to such a point that they're at the greatest risk of annihilation given impending climate change. Maybe Indigenous foods, fibres, tools, medicines and shelters are the future. Maybe this is kind of a gift. Maybe what we have as Indigenous people is to offer a gift. And so, how does this relate to Antarctica? Absolutely, if I know, sorry. I think what I really wanted to get to was the question of which stories do we listen to? What do we choose to listen to? How do we position the stories we hear? Are they just stories or are they something greater? I want to ask people, is traditional knowledge just that, or is it also science? I think there's an incredible amount of change possible through Indigenous knowledge systems and ways of relating to and understanding country. A total change in worldviews, a worldview in reciprocal relation, care and repair, that's not bothered by trying to maintain access to every type of food or resource at every time of the year. Of ways of thinking about land management, of land zoning, compartmentalisation, cataloguing, methods of teaching what's important. And while we have the right to maintain, control, protect and develop this intellectual property, we also need willing participants, allies, not white saviours, allies who can support this change so that we can see and be proud of a future where blackfellow knowledge, where black joy, black cultural expression is not repressed, but it's given a place to thrive. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks, Brad. We'll come back to some of that. gives me great pleasure to introduce Deb Adams. Deb Adams is an architect, senior associate and sustainability lead at BKK Architects. In 2025, she was the awards chair for the Australian Institute of Architects Victorian Chapter Sustainability Award and is on the Chapter Sustainability Working Group. A passionate advocate for sustainability and building less to do more, she brings 2 decades of learning from her time as an architect in the UK and here in Australia. With experience in residential, education and cultural projects, she strives to create designs that positively impact their communities while creating lasting social and environmental benefit. Welcome, Deb.
Thanks, Naomi. Jesus Christ, Brad, I've got to follow that, for God's sake. All right, let's give it a whirl. I feel like I'm going to be depressing in comparison. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what does designing for extremes look like in the context of Australia. Biodiversity is in decline. I'm really starting on the cheery stuff here. The climate is changing at an unprecedented rate and extreme events are becoming more frequent and intense. Climate change is already making extreme flooding more frequent and intense, and by 2050, 100-year floods are projected to occur at least twice as frequently as today across 40% of the planet. And the image here is the recent flooding in Katherine, which suffered I think they hit 100-year flooding events twice in about 2 weeks. So, what are the costs if we do nothing? Because we've had a lot of nothing here in Australia in the last government. One the business community will probably make their ears sing is loss of commercial revenues. Insurance becomes unaffordable. That's already happening in some more rural areas of Australia. The financial cost of inaction is passed on to the next generation. Deloitte released a report this year that Generation Alpha is actually looking at a cost of $185,000 per person over their lifetime if we continue to do nothing. Population displacement to flood and fire risk is likely to increase. That will then lead to pressure on resources, food and water resources shrink, and a risk of conflict, which then obviously leads to more migration and resource pressures. Climate-induced displacement is already happening. It's already here. The people of Tuvalu, which is a small nation in the South Pacific, are already facing climate displacement. The Australian government has agreed to gradually relocate these people to mainland Australia. They've already started coming as of this year. This is also impacting us closer to home with the Torres Strait. They're battling rising sea levels as well. And they're not only are they trying to enact measures to help save the Torres Strait Islands, but they're also taking the government to court over their continued inaction. Not sure where that case is at, but it's an interesting one if you want to follow it. So, it's not all terrible news. There are plenty of innovative folks out there, and hopefully there's plenty here in the room tonight. I'm just going to run through very quickly 3 case studies, because I've not got a lot of time, just in terms of different types of projects and how we can address some of these issues. This was a project we actually did with Realm Studios in conjunction with Monash University. It's one of China's sponge cities. And this essentially deals with extreme flooding, water pollution through filtration, and also sort of water regulation. This is over in Kunshan in China. I can't remember how many of these projects have been rolled out to date, but there's quite a few of them now across China. If you want more information, please ask Tim. He's here in the audience. He'll tell you more. This is a floating house project, and these are prefabricated dwellings for central Vietnam. It's an area that receives a lot of heavy rainfall, but again, they're facing severe climate change, and these flooding events are becoming more and more common. So they're trying to get a bit more proactive. These actually are fixed using ballasts, and they sort of displace as the water levels rise, and they can house up to 8 people, I think, for a short space of time. So very sort of low-cost, ingenious solutions happening, which is great to see. And closer to home, this is in New South Wales. It's a house called Amongst the Eucalypts. As you can see, it's a stunning location. One of the things that the architects really tried to do here was they wanted to mitigate biodiversity loss. Unfortunately, they also happened to be in one of the highest fire-rated zones, so they had a real battle on their hands to avoid this, but through pretty careful discussions with New South Wales CFA, they managed to minimise biodiversity loss and worked hard with, I think, a lot of Victorian suppliers, I think a few in Ballarat, to get some pretty ingenious facade solutions to that. So, on to the cheery stuff. We can be hopeful because we as a design profession, through some of these examples, smarts, we can show what's possible. Through innovative design, advocacy and policy, and most importantly, as Brad's highlighted, and Jirra will talk to more, learning from First Nations knowledge on how we can better manage country and what it truly means to care for country and how we can take that knowledge to help hopefully save our future.
Our next speaker is Jirra Lulla, who is Director of Kalinya Studios, a design and strategy consultancy weaving Indigenous knowledge into city shaping projects. Specialising in a nature-led approach to the revitalisation of urban precincts, Jirra works towards a future in which our cities are in healthy relationship with land, water and sky. Jirra is a Yorta and Wiradjuri woman with ties to Kamarunja and the Miranda Sandhills. Raised in the Koori community, Jirra has travelled the world, learning from communities who practice stewardship as an expression of joy. She holds a BA, Media and Communications, was Arts Leadership Fellow at the National Gallery of Australia, and is an Innovation Fellow at RMIT University. Is that true? Fancy that, she was. Please welcome Jirra.
Thank you. It is a funny, like, are we here or here? Thank you so much. My name is Jirra Lulla. I'm a Yorta and Wiradjuri woman. I first want to pay my respects to this beautiful country that we get to work on, to live on, that cares for us, to traditional custodians, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, their neighbours, the Bunurong, the Boonwurrung people. Tonight, I'm going to speak quite quickly on reframing the idea of extreme environments in a local context through an Indigenous lens of relationality and regeneration. I also wanted to introduce the way that I work. I have a studio, Kalinya, and like you said, we weave Indigenous knowledge into city shaping projects. So what does that mean? This is a methodology we've been working on for a couple of years now, and it's based on our coil weaving technique. And it is about weaving strands of collectivist knowledge to create vessels of collaboration. So on every project that we work on, it's a methodology that scales up and down. We've used it for small scale, semi-permanent activations, and we used it for precinct redevelopments. But we start always with traditional custodians, and then we tap into the knowledge of a Koori plant collective. This is like my joy, working with the Koori plant collectives and traditional custodians. I spend a lot of time in nature with rangers now, which was new for me. I come from like a brand marketing business background. So I used to spend a lot of time on screens, and now all my time pretty much is on country. And so the Koori Plant Collective are people that are out there every day on the ground. They're the ones doing cool burns. They're the ones collecting seeds and bringing endangered species back to life. And so when we work on projects, and I'm bringing that kind of brand narrative perspective, you know, we love a compelling narrative. It's amazing to have this collective knowledge to be able to check back in on and say, you know, does this story still represent a truth? Are we still bringing ecological value to our cities? And then we have creative collaborators, both locally and globally. I love working with people who are tapping into their own intergenerational knowledges through design. And we have a next generation advisory. And this might be one of the smartest things I've done in my business. It's a group of young Aboriginal people working in the built environment. They are designers, ecologists, urban planners, and they keep my business bold. They keep me thinking about the future. They are not interns, they are advisors. And so I take projects to them because we're designing cities that they'll inherit. And so when they advise me that we're not being bold enough, I will push further. So again, acknowledging country. I also wanted to acknowledge Naomi Caroline Briggs, who has recently been inducted into the Design Institute's Hall of Fame. I think that is incredible. Her knowledge, I know she shared so much knowledge in this building. And I want to pay my respects again to Wiradjuri, where my studio is located on Wiradjuri Wurrung land. So I've been spending a lot of time and with Uncle Dave learning so much from Narrop Rangers. I think that it is a responsibility for any of us that are designing on country to align our projects to the priorities of traditional custodians, and now that's becoming a lot easier because Wiradjuri have released their whole of country plan, and it is publicly available on their website. So I recommend anyone designing on Wiradjuri country to make sure that that's like your first starting point. So when thinking about extreme environments, it's something that I've been thinking about for ages actually, and talking to my colleagues, my Maori colleagues, about this idea that Australia is thought of as a harsh place, right? This harsh, scary land with all of these animals that are out to kill you. And where did that narrative come from, and where did it start? And what kind of fear does that hold? You know, are people holding on to a fear from when their ancestors landed on a country that they didn't know how to read, they didn't know where to find water, they didn't know where the animals were and their behaviours? And how do we let go of some of that fear to start designing more in relationship with place and in relationship with nature? And so I reached out to a colleague, Wirangi, because he's done his thesis on Maori concepts of beauty in contemporary architecture. And we were talking, I know that your country too, like your land that you're from, your ancestors' land, is likely to be places that feel extreme to a lot of people. So how do you approach this idea of designing in an extreme environment from a Maori perspective? And he was talking to me about Maori, and he speaks of it as the ever-presence of Maori reminds us that every place holds a living force waiting to be recognised rather than controlled. What we call a harsh environment often reflects a break in relationship rather than a quality of the place itself. When we shift perspectives, these conditions become expressions of Maori, not problems to solve, but forces to understand. In learning to move with them, something else emerges, a quieter beauty, not applied, but revealed. It lives in alignment, in restraint, in forms that belong because they respond. I think he's talking about that feeling when you go to those special places, right? And I think a lot of people understand that feeling when they go to places like Uluru, where country holds a really big presence. Sometimes it inspires awe, sometimes it inspires fear. But I think that when you start unpacking ideas of extreme or harsh landscapes, we think about that life force within country. Where I'm from, Cummeragunja is a place that, it's a special place. And I think a lot of people would feel that when they go there. And so I wanted to show you a little bit of Cummera. I'm going to show you a clip from a film that we made last year with my collaborator, April Day, with Gurra, we're an Aboriginal filmmaking company, and with community at Cummera. And part of the motivation was that I was working in industry and people kept asking me to explain what country is. And it's too big a word. You know, I can't translate it into English. And so I thought the best approach is for me to go home to country and to ask my elders what country means to them.
You know, we always say we're Aboriginal, but there's more to it than that. It's connection to spirit and land. Take time to sit on the river. And, I mean, everyone felt this today. The magic of it, you know. And I'm sure everyone felt it. You listen to the birds and their songs. Yeah, they'll tell you things.
Cummeragunja means our home. I've been really blessed. I worked with all my old uncles, we call them, in the forest, you know, and that was at university. How to respect your culture and your elders.
You had to recharge your energies. And that's how I felt when I come home. First thing I do before I get out of my car is take my shoes off and put my feet on the ground and feel my country.
So I'm really lucky that when I get to join design projects, you know, I'm not just bringing my own voice, but we're weaving these collective knowledges, and it makes me so much more confident walking into different spaces, knowing that I'm bringing the wisdom that is so generously shared with me day in and day out. So going back to this idea of Australia as a harsh and scary landscape, when I think about that, I think about crocodiles. I'm from down here and I'm as scared of crocodiles as anyone, but it made me think about my friend Donnie, who has a beautiful practice of reading country and of documenting country through film and photography. And he's from the East Kimberley, where he's so comfortable with crocodiles and understands their movements and behaviours so much that he is happy to camp on the riverbanks at night in croc waters, which of course terrifies me. And it just goes back to, I think, to that idea of when we're designing for what we perceive as extreme, it's so important to be working with people who know that place, who can read that country and who are in relationship with it, who understand the small shifts, the small changes, and of course the overwhelming beauty of it. And so what does this look like in practice, in built form? I think any of us working in, around, inspired by regenerative design should be going out to Budge BIM multiple times a year. It is such a special place. It is an incredible example of when traditional owners are in the driving seat, and that they're leading what design looks like from this multidisciplinary, multi-generational perspective. It is only a couple of hours out of Melbourne, and that was Tyson. Tyson's somebody that I call on, of course, for Koori plant expertise. And again, I just feel so lucky that when I come onto projects and we're working on, say, a landscape project, an urban green space, that I have these amazing people out in community that are willing to share their knowledge to make sure that we're bringing plants back into the city and back to Victorian landscapes. This is their seasonal dial. But yeah, Budge BIM, the cultural landscape, it was the first ever UNESCO World Heritage listing based on Aboriginal cultural values. So it is world leading stuff. It's based on their aquaculture systems that are some of the oldest in the world. And for us to have this kind of global standard of design a couple of hours out of the city, I do think it's one of those places that as practitioners we should be going to regularly. So as with everything, I took this concept of like, how do we rethink extreme environments in a local context, to relationality, to respect, to regeneration, to the next gen advisory. And an incredible young woman, a young scientist, said this to me, and I can't believe I haven't thought about it before, but she said, we need to stop calling the impacts of climate change natural disasters. These are manufactured disasters. And I think the idea that we keep calling them natural disasters is going back to that idea of man versus nature, that it is our job somehow to conquer nature, and that is this terrifying force that is coming at us. But actually, when they're manufactured disasters, while it can feel overwhelming, it means that we all have this part to play in it, right? And as much as, I think I also used to get climate anxiety and feel daunted by how rapidly things are changing. Now that I'm spending so much time in nature, now I'm spending so much time with rangers and elders, I wake up feeling positive about it because I have strengthened my own personal relationship with nature.
Thank you so much, Jirra. And our last speaker is Dr. Miranda Nieboer. She is an architect, researcher, curator, and creative practitioner whose work examines how humans inhabit extreme environments with a particular focus on Antarctica. Her research sits at the intersection of spatial design, environmental humanities, and climate science, exploring how people design, build, and live in conditions shaped by environmental constraint, risk, and rapid change. Rather than proposing universal solutions, her work considers what extreme environments reveal about adaptation, limits, care, and responsibility in the built environment. Her practice spans field-based research, exhibition development, and interdisciplinary collaboration with scientists, designers, and policy practitioners. She engages with architects, landscape architects, and those working in governance with questions around design, infrastructure, and decision-making in contexts increasingly shaped by climate uncertainty. Welcome, Miranda.
Now, first, let me test this out. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah? Okay, thank you. And thank you, Naomi, for this introduction. Thank you all for being here. And it's great to see some familiar faces. And it's an absolute privilege to present alongside Jirra, Bradley, and Deb. Each of us approaches tonight's theme from different relationships to place. And my contribution begins on the Antarctic plateau. But the question it raises returns us to Australia and elsewhere in the world. One question, for example, is how could we design within conditions of uncertainty and change? I would like to start with a claim that might unsettle our architectural discipline. Architecture depends on the assumption of stable ground, and that assumption is no longer reliable when we take Antarctica's geophysicality, the ice, into account. The continent challenges our most fundamental architectural concepts: interiority, comfort, and inhabitation itself. My perspective comes from joining and researching a logistical traverse which departed from a coastal station and moved across the Antarctic plateau to Concordia Station, 1,100 kilometers inland. The convoy included 7 heavy-duty tractors, 2 snowplows, cargo, fuel, food, scientific equipment, and a small team of 10 people. Our goal? To resupply Concordia Station that operates all year round. And it took us about 12 days to reach the station. Now, clearly, a traverse is not a building, it's not a station, it's not a fixed point. It is a way of living dependent on habit, routine, and collective attentiveness, a set of practices. Each day is structured by repeated actions. The silent breakfasts, the maintenance of tractors, the careful morning departures, the rolling of engine covers, the connecting and disconnecting of cargo, the nightly refueling, and the constant reading of the weather. And these are just a few examples. And they are not peripheral tasks. They are the performances that enable life and inhabitation. And they force us to ask, what if architecture is not primarily about objects, but about the habits that sustain us? To sharpen this, let's consider the language we use. To inhabit is literally to be in habit, to dwell through repeated actions. Interiority in architectural discourse is tied to terra, the solid ground, and to the idea of being inside something stable. Comfort too is conventionally imagined as a condition engineered into an interior through insulation, HVAC, and controlled atmospheres. But what happens when the ground itself is not stable? When interiority cannot rely on solid earth? When comfort cannot be installed, but must be practiced. Antarctica forces these questions because its massive glacial volume, which even deforms our planet, is a moving body. Ice builds, flows, drifts, breaks, calves, creeps, seeps, twists, folds, squeaks, cracks, roars, and melts. Ice cannot be owned, settled, bounded, or secured in the ways humans try to do with solid ground. Most Antarctic stations, however, are located on the sparse, snow-free coastal areas and rocky outcrops. Rock provides a solid foundation. Stone allows anchoring. Stone allows the symbolic act of planting a flag. On stone, architecture can behave as it expects to. The traverse, however, reveals what inhabitation looks like when stability and permanence are impossible. And crucially, on a traverse, even habit is unstable. Repetition, the very thing that makes inhabitation possible, is continuously interrupted and unsettled by the Antarctic environment. As said before, ice moves, and the wind increases to katabatic strength. Light changes and turns into whiteouts. The atmosphere thickens, and temperatures plummet. Nothing holds still long enough to become routine. And yet repetition is always remade, rebuilt, reassembled. The moment a rhythm is found, Antarctica fractures it, and the team must recreate another rhythm. Habit becomes something provisional, something negotiated, something continually re-established in relation to conditions that refuse to stabilize. This is why inhabitation on the traverse demands creativity, adaptability, and situational awareness. It requires the ability to read subtle environmental cues, to adjust practices on the fly, to rebuild interiority again, again, and again in an icescape that resists enclosure. Inhabiting the traverse allowed me to recognize the 4 following lessons. Number 1, inhabitation is relational. It's never solitary or purely human. On the traverse, you live with machines, with weather systems, with ice. The icescape is not a passive background, but an active participant, shaping every decision and every movement. Antarctic inhabitation is best described as a form of cohabitation with the ice. Lesson number 2, habit and comfort are dynamic. They shift with Antarctica. Adaptation is not an emergency response. It's a baseline condition that enables both survival and thriving. Third lesson, resilience is a practice. It's not a material property. It's not a technical specification. It's a capacity, a way of responding, adjusting, and improvising. On the traverse, resilience emerges from shared knowledge, embodied understanding, and collective decision-making. This is not romantic. It's practical. And it's the difference between safety and danger. Attentive care is a form of environmental literacy, cultivated through practice. These 4 lessons challenge architecture's attachment to permanence, enclosure, and control. They ask us to reconsider inhabitation and interiority not as a retreat from the world, but as a way of engaging with it. The traverse shows that architecture can exist without the fantasy of permanence, but only if it's willing to rethink its foundations. Antarctica does not give us answers about what we should build. The continent gives us conditions, it gives us questions, and it gives us a challenge to explore what assumptions are we still building on? What forms of stability do we cling to? And what fantasies of control do we refuse to relinquish? What might architecture become if it accepted movement, uncertainty, and relationality as its starting point? These are not technical questions. They are conceptual, ethical, and existential. Antarctica asks us to rethink what architecture is for, what it protects, and what it assumes. Inhabiting the traverse, learning to live with the ice rather than against it, is what Antarctica can teach us about responsible and imaginative inhabitation on this planet. Antarctica does not hand us a blueprint. It hands us questions and some recommendations as pay attention, recognize relationship, accept movement and change. And perhaps Antarctica's greatest lesson is that comfort is not the softening of the world around us, but the strengthening of our own capacity to live with complexity. Thank you.
Thank you, Miranda. A remarkable series of presentations and also highly diverse, quite difficult to draw together, but fortunately I have some pre-prepared questions. And I wanted to start by asking all of you, or each of you, about the feel of extreme environments, and especially remote ones. They're often associated with ideas about loneliness, isolation, and wildness, or indeed wilderness, a highly contested term, which can be framed on the one hand as threatening and risky, or as connecting humans with something precious and elemental. And certainly in the Creative Antarctica exhibition, invariably every artist who describes having been to Antarctica has been transformed by that experience. So people do seem to be transformed by extreme environments of all kinds. And so I want to ask you about this question of feeling, the feel of such places. And maybe, Jirra, we might start with you, because you've touched explicitly on this in your presentation, and different types of beauty.
I think I have a different kind of perspective on this, because in recent years, the only time that I go to places that are, I think what you're talking about, like remote and those places with those big feelings, I only ever go with traditional custodians. Aboriginal tourism is amazing, you know, that you can be guided by people who, you know, I guess suggest relationality through action. And so my experience is never overwhelming anymore. The places that feel extreme to me are when I'm in urban environments where we have lost our connection to waterways. That feels extreme to me. You know, when I walk through our cities and I see our river polluted or uncared for, when I'm in environments only with concrete and no plants, to me they're the only places that really feel extreme.
And Brad, you invoked the word wilderness, I believe, and, you know, somewhat questioned that word. So how do you approach this, or what do you say about the feel of wild places?
I concur with Jirra. I was going to say pretty much the same thing. I think it's wild that, like, places like this kind of make me feel a little bit anxious, whereas places that are defined as isolated feel far less isolated. I think it's wild. When I first moved here, that you can't swim in the Birrarung. Everywhere we went on holidays, we would go for, you know, it was always around water, fresh or salt or brackish water. It always involved like going out on a tinny and finding the perfect spot to get mud crabs. Whereas coming here, I still remember the first time, it's so embarrassing, sorry everyone. I still remember the first time I caught a train here, and I messaged my dad and I was like, this is wild, I'm on a train. So I mean, I completely agree.
Deb, you talked about how extreme environments are actually coming closer by the minute. and the extreme is in fact already here in urban places as well. So how do you approach this question of what we might describe as the affective or feeling aspects of that extreme?
I think it's in terms of, I think they can be positive and negative environments. I think they're challenging, but I think they can also be quite freeing if you think about more of the, I guess, the nature-based aspect to things. But to coin a weather expression, I am British and we like to talk about the weather a lot. That basically it's about preparedness and how in that environment are we expecting to be there? Are we kitted out? Are we wearing the right clothes? Are we anticipating that environment? I think that notion of if you're dropped into a situation you're not expecting makes something extreme. But I think to Jirra's point as well, it is about what it sort of feels familiar, and everyone's perception that is different. And I think that's even down to things like body temperature and how we regulate temperature as individuals is very personable. But I think as we move forward in design, and particularly things like heat stress, we need to be thinking about the most vulnerable in our societies and how do we help them through that, both in our urban environments and what we build as well.
Are you familiar with the Scandinavian expression, "There's no bad weather, only bad clothing"?
Yes. As a British person, I am.
You would be, yes. So Miranda, you've described your experience in Antarctica, which is pretty remarkable, no matter which way you slice it. What did you come back transformed from that experience? What did that feel like?
That's a great question. I think that whoever goes to Antarctica and stays there for a while is being transformed. Because the way we walk here, and the Antarcticans in the room will say like, different way of walking. It's become slipping, sliding, gliding. Depending on where you are in Antarctica, you might experience no sunset. It stays the whole summer, just you see the sun. So there's a time disruption that you physically feel. When you get high enough on the plateau, it's so cold that you need to extra gear up, extreme weather gear, where sensing becomes different. I think even neurological science have shown that the higher you get and the colder you get, your brain rewires. So there is a physiological change. We don't turn in monsters. Yeah, and that's aside the awness, of course, and all the other stories that you hear is true. But there is a transformation. Yeah.
Jirra, I want to come back to you and ask you about time. So, Australian Indigenous time frames go back 60,000 years. Antarctic ice holds hundreds of thousands of years of climate memory, but planning and design horizons tend to be 30, 50 years, sometimes less. How do you design to an Indigenous timescale, and how do you design for intergenerational stewardship?
Firstly, can I come to Antarctica with you? Great. Time's such an interesting one, right? Like when we're working in industry, and it's one of the reasons that I kind of needed to take a couple of years to spend a lot of time in community and with my elders to understand what this methodology would be, and it became really, really clear that it needed to be intergenerational. And I think that it is a shared Indigenous lens from, everywhere I've been in the world, that there is this idea of 7 generations, what's it called, 7 generation stewardship? Or like cathedral thinking, I think, is like a Western approach to it, of creating and designing things that you will never see. And I don't know, it's something that is just so expected of us. That the challenge was to come up with a way of working that was able to weave into industries where it's not the norm. And that's really why every project spans at least 4 generations. You know, every project is guided by elders. A lot of practitioners are around the same generation-ish. And then we've got the Next Gen Advisory, and at the moment we're also working on a project that is designed with children. So I think it's the auntie duties that come out, you know, like I'm always just thinking about how we're creating for them.
And following on from that, what are some practical approaches that you apply when working in industry and weaving an Indigenous approach to time and stewardship into your daily work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably one of the biggest challenges. Brad could probably speak on that as well, that it is an expectation for us to look after country and look after country into the future. And for us, time is more circular in that our elders' experiences are alive here now in this room, and our future generations' experiences are alive here. And so our job is just to be, I guess, a present conduit for that and to contribute the best we can. I think it's also for a lot of us now that there's this increasing interest in Indigenous knowledges, it's a huge pressure, right? Like there's a lot of responsibility on our shoulders as practitioners. So really taking that approach of every project, I just try to bring things that my community have suggested will work, and it's really up to industry how deeply they listen.
Do you want to say anything about time, Bradley, or shall I ask you a different question?
Sorry. I think just on the back of that, design and architecture in the world that we live in, we're always trying to combat 2 things. We're trying to combat like a living cultural heritage with a colonially enforced way of doing and performing and acting and enacting. And a lot of the work that like we try to do and we feel is a responsibility, and a responsibility that's been entrusted in us, is to use these positions as positions of advocacy. And so much of what we do is like trying to celebrate and reintroduce ideas of joy and traditional knowledge and like just celebrating Black culture. But, you know, is there a willingness to take that up on a project? Is there a willingness to take that up, and in what capacity? Yeah, I think it's a really challenging thing. And I did have one more slide, but I chose to take it out and now I'm regretting it, which was Uncle Gary Foley's essay on native title is not land back. So if everyone wants to read that, I'd highly recommend it.
Bradley, staying with you, you were talking in your presentation about dominant narratives of man conquering hostile nature, particularly obviously when it comes to Mount Everest, but also in relation to Antarctica. And what is a different story drawn from oceanic or Indigenous perspectives, including Maori and Polynesian exploration? How do we turn that story around, and what do you think would be a more appropriate story to tell?
I forgot to pre-read your questions.
You can say pass.
No, I think it's a really good question, and I think it ties back into the idea of time. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier, having a yarn with a few different elders, uncles, and aunties. I tried to make a really funny joke earlier, but I don't know if anyone picked up on it. It was that Bunurong, Boomerang and Wiradjuri people stopped visiting their neighbours in Tasmania when the bridge closed, which was the water passing over Bass Strait, the old land bridge. And the oral stories and oral histories and the stories that are passed down relate quite closely to stories of the Western scientific narratives of how rivers are formed, how mountains are formed, how different geological movements have happened over time. So I think it's just a matter of treating those oral stories and Indigenous ways of passing on knowledge with the same amount of respect and care as we do like Western science.
Mm-hmm. Miranda, thinking, because you're a practicing architect as well as doing, or at least you're a registered architect, even if not currently practicing. So your research is producing knowledge about extreme environments that the world does need right now. How does that knowledge travel? How do you use your experiences in Antarctica in the rest of your design practice?
Yeah, that's a good one. So when I kind of move from Antarctica, what sticks with me is the questioning of spatial assumptions, the embodied knowledge, but more the kind of unsettling of perceptions. So that's also kind of a question mark. And definitely a kind of interdisciplinary approach. That sounds maybe cliche, but it's more the kind of, on the traverse I had to perform different roles. There is no segmentation of you're in that box or you're in that box. So these kind of 3 areas I bring to curation of Antarctic exhibitions, my own creative work, to design studios with students, and also current research into cold facilities. That's what I bring with me, or sticks with me.
And Deb, in your work with BKK, you're working across a lot of interdisciplinary teams. Where do you find that the sustainability or climate brief sometimes falters or gets lost or obscured, let's say, lost in translation? And how do you keep it alive through the life of a project, even against resistance potentially?
I was actually just having a pre-conversation before we started and sort of touched on this a little bit. I think, unfortunately, we are in quite a risk-averse country, and gets a lot of stifling of innovation. I think there's a lot of really great products and solutions and processes out there which can be quite difficult to get across the line if they're untried and untested here, and that can be in the form of pushback from regulation, contractors, and as we've seen with COVID, supply chain, trying to get some of these new and exciting products and even tradespeople into the country can be a challenge. I think in terms of keeping it alive, the way we try to work is that we'd like to have these conversations as early as possible. In my dream world, we would have a sustainability consultant on every project before we'd even sort of scratch the surface of the brief, and that would be a non-negotiable to sort of walk, I guess, really attack that early. But it's really about having the right design team as well. You want the people with shared values, and that's across the board. And then really just, I think, keep talking about it, keep having the conversations in the office with consultants, and then bring it up at every design stage and just keep fighting for it, because it's not always easy, but we need to get it across the line.
A related question, doing that kind of work and doing sort of design for extremes writ large, what does it actually require of you practically that conventional design doesn't?
I think at the moment, the regulations, they're the bare minimum. You know, that's just the way it is, and industry likes to lobby us to get beyond that. But I think it's really, it's about pushing beyond that. It's about asking for more. And, you know, most people who work in this space will say that it's not about sustainability. We've got to push beyond that. It's about regenerative design. We've got to start repairing what we've got stuffed up. About if we're working on a project, it's about making it better than when we started, whether that's through reintroducing native species, trying to make the most of what we've got that's already there instead of just taking the position to knock everything down and start again, this overconsumptive culture that I think, and it's about, I think as I touched on earlier, it's about thinking on a big urban scale. How do we make our cities livable? How do we get more green space, more tree canopies in? How do we make our waterways so that we can swim in them and enjoy them more and not just treat them as a, pollution. So I think it's about that thinking on different scales. It's not just about the project that you're working on. It's trying to influence things at a larger urban scale.
Mm. So, Jirra, you do this every day of the week. And as you have observed, country-centred design, it's not a methodology that you can just download. It's relational, it's place-specific, it's built up over time. Can you tell us a bit more about your own journey in developing these kinds of capacities and abilities in developing a country-centred approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Like it's something so personal. And we all have, we have collectivist ideas around what country and what country-centred design is, and we also have our personal lived experiences of it, and we're shaped by our own country and the priorities of our country. And so it was really important for me to spend time at Camera. For a bit of context, Cammergunja is an incredibly important and powerful place. A lot of Aboriginal leaders, civil rights leaders have come from there. The Cammergunja walk-off is kind of considered one of the first Australian civil rights movements. My grandmother was a baby walking in the Camera walk-off. But these days, living off country, a lot of the times that we go back to country are for funerals. So Camera is also a traditional burial ground. It's where I will go to rest. So, have these kind of, when we talk about time and responsibilities to place, it is the place that I will have my final resting. So I have a responsibility to be in relationship with it. And all my ancestors and my loved ones and my family are all there. But you start associating, and I think this is another experience that a lot of Indigenous people around the world share when we live in urban environments, that your connection to country becomes also one surrounded by grief. And so a part of this project, when I started working more in the built environment, I knew that I wanted to spend a lot of time with traditional custodians here, and I knew that it was really important for me to have a deeper relationship with my country and with place that extended beyond grief and had layers of joy and creativity. And so that's where the project Holding Space came in last year, and it fundamentally changed my practice. When you create like that, we're just out on country for 5 days with our elders. We have so many distractions normally. Our industry is very fast-paced. But we wanted to film as the sun was coming up, and so elders get up early too. So we will start filming at 4:30. So you've got no emails, no text, nothing. You're just there on the riverbank watching the sun come up, and your elders are talking. And, yes, they're talking to the camera, but they're talking to you. And so I got this day after day after day. You come home from an experience like that changed, and the thing that they just kept saying was, it is about the waterways. Our ways of life depend on the water. And since that time, every project that I've worked on has been about our relationship to waterways, and in an urban context, understanding that Melbourne is a wetland. And until we start designing, with this city as a wetland, climate responsiveness kind of can't happen until we are in relationship with that.
So shortly we're going to go to questions from the audience. So start gathering your questions, and to buy you some time, we're going to do the lightning round. So Bradley, this is going to be challenging for you if you haven't read them in advance, because the point is to answer this question in a very pithy way, possibly with a single word. So I'm going to start with Miranda. That's going to give you 3 people to make your position, articulate it. What is one design practice or material that we commonly use today, you might not use it, but others might use it, that people in 2050 will look back and say, holy moly, what were they thinking? They were designing for a different planet. Miranda, you first.
More than one word?
Well, it can be a sentence, but the point is that it's a lightning round, yes.
Building for stable climate.
Say that again, buildings
for stable climate.
Okay,
So
excellent. Jirra.
I think we'll shift from flood mitigation to designing with waterways.
Mm-hmm.
I really hope that we're not still talking about plastic.
Plastic.
Daylighting waterways and rammed earth with zero cement with structural capacity.
As in, they'll look back and look at that and say...
As in, I think...
That's what they'll be doing.
Yeah.
Very good. All right, second question. Second lightning question. What keeps you in this work, even when it feels overwhelming? We're going to go back the other way. So, Bradley, what keeps you in the work?
I have absolutely no idea.
That's okay. That's legitimate.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I think I do have like a sense of hope for the future.
Very good. Deb?
Curiosity. I think meeting people outside of traditional built environment practice and having different perspectives and experiences, kind of keeps you hopeful.
Jirra?
Auntie Judy's.
Very good. Miranda?
I'll join Deb. Curiosity, definitely.
Curiosity. We have a match. And the last of the lightning questions before we throw to questions from the floor is, what's one thing you'd like every audience member to take away from this session and set to work in their own practice tomorrow? We're coming back in the other direction again. Miranda?
Attentiveness as a design skill.
Mine's real practical. Plant endangered species that are local to here and buy them from Aboriginal-owned nurseries.
Very good. Very good.
Innovate and advocate.
They're all such pithy responses. Well done. Oh, God. Stop referring to non-endemic species as exotics.
Why do you say that?
Because
That's a good one.
exotics carries with it a loaded term, I think. And if we started calling them invasives, then I think that people would stop using them.
Very good. All right. Do we have questions from the floor? Maybe we don't. Maybe we have to go straight from the top. Yes, we do.
Thanks for a very inspiring set of presentations. I'm just looking at the increasing tourism around Antarctica and those sorts of places. I'm just wondering what the panel's thoughts are there places on our planet where we should not be going?
An excellent question. Do you want to start, Miranda, given your Antarctic focus?
Very good question. Tourism is, at this moment, hyper-regulated through the IATO, and at the same time, super under pressure. I don't hold the answer. It's a very urgent question, and many researchers around the world are diving into this, because it becomes quite problematic. And where do you draw the line? Who is allowed to go? Who is not allowed to go? How many or not? Is there a gap? Do we put a gap on it? So many questions, and an urgent question, all I can say. Sorry, I don't have the answer.
Do others on the panel wish to answer that question?
I know from in terms of energy perspective and sort of fuel consumption and things to get there, it's pretty high. So there is an argument, certainly from a sustainability perspective, that we shouldn't be encouraging tourism there. But I think, that broader question of who is allowed to go and who isn't it's very problematic. I definitely agree with that.
Jirra, you might want to answer. It doesn't have to be with regard to Antarctica, but the rest of the question about...
Not yet. It will be after I go to Antarctica with you.
Then you can ban it.
Yeah, so I've seen a couple of examples of Indigenous tourism operators take over existing tourism places and put in place a way of, I guess, sharing the place, right? Like, so the places of strong cultural significance become not available to tourists, but other really beautiful places become available to tourists. And then when an area gets overpopulated, it's kind of moved on. So I think it goes back to your point around this kind of perceived need for permanence in experience that I think, Indigenous stewardship in tourism takes that approach of how many people can be on country and be like in relationship with the place rather than having an extractive experience of the place.
Got nothing? It's actually interesting to note, I'll help you out here, that the Creative Antarctica exhibition, part of the narrative, Phil Samartnis will correct me if I'm wrong, is really about the role of artists in mediating that experience and bringing it back for the rest of us. I don't ever expect to go to Antarctica, too much to my sorrow, but things like exhibitions and the work of writers and artists and photographers and et cetera, is in many ways a kind of appropriate way to shape that vision, that imaginary of such remote places, and to do that work of sharing the story and the remarkableness of the place. Do we have another question?
Thanks, everyone. That was excellent. Of your clients, how many are aware and want to engage around the idea of designing for extreme environments and sustainability? Do you think this is something that is in the conversation, is in the zeitgeist that people care about, or is this something you're pushing for often? Like, obviously, you've got residential, government clients, commercial clients, but what's the general vibe?
I think it is challenging. I think Jirra touched on this around time. We are often faced with, on a big scale, short-termism of governments that care about electoral cycles, unfortunately. So I think having organisations that go beyond that and outlast governments would be a good thing when it comes to this. I think it varies. I think sometimes with private residential clients, they do think about it, particularly when someone's invested in their forever home, they tend to care a bit more. But I think, look, educational institutions are often leading the way in those kind of conversations because they are part of cities. We're in RMIT, very much part of Melbourne, so I think it does vary. It just depends on, I think, potentially long-term asset ownership, which obviously universities are. So, yeah, it varies from client to client.
Anyone else want to take that one? All right. I think I saw another question towards middle at the back.
Hi, thanks very much. Great talk, really interesting. I'd just like to ask each of you, what would be one key piece of advice you'd give someone who wants to build sustainably on a super cheap budget?
Oh, who am I going to give that one to first? Bradley's got his eyes closed.
Yeah, I think that you'll find that there's a lot of people who are really into sharing materials and resources, and there are a lot of resources hubs that exist around Melbourne where you can find materials. You just have to be creative with the way that you use them.
Let's go along, Deb.
I think a lot of research, to be honest, and using resources like Brad just mentioned, trying to limit how much you use, so less of things like surface applied materials, as much as you can cut that down. And actually, one of the best ways is to build smaller. It means that you can do more with less and focus your budget. Just an example, the average Australian house is getting bigger, not smaller. So I think, getting small, creative, and sharing, I think.
Jirra?
I'm not an architect, so I'm going to talk about plants. But local plants are generally cheaper to buy. And so I've got like pretty inner city apartment, balcony, very challenging to grow things out, and I thought I need to be able to practice what I preach. So I've been getting, endangered plants. I've been getting local Victorian plants, putting them on this challenging balcony where nothing else grows, and they're so happy, and they're pretty, and there's butterflies, and there's possums, and there's this whole majestic thing happening in my city balcony. They need less water. they're like, honestly, like $11 most of the time. So I think that that's something I can speak on.
4 words: recycled materials, tiny home.
All right, we're almost at time, and Kara is going to bring it home for us. But first, I'd like you all to join me in thanking our exceptional panel.